Yesterday, we looked at UC Berkeley's failing grades data and what it surfaces about the gap between AI-assisted performance and actual learning. We ended on a question. The exam works as a check because it removes the tool, but we only build that check in a few times a year, usually at the end. Are there domains where that check is built in to every single practice session, where you can't perform learning without actually doing it? Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So the answer to that question is yes. The two places where it's obvious are the performing arts and athletics. A violinist practices by playing the violin. The assessment, that is the recital, is also playing the violin. The same instrument, the same physical demands, the same unassisted production of sound. There's no proxy layer between the learning and the demonstration of learning. You can't summarize the Brahms sonata and hand it in. You can't ask the AI to run the scales for you and then show up at the recital. The performance requires the learning to have happened, and there's no structural gap in which a substitute can hide. The same is true for a basketball player running plays in practice or a dancer rehearsing choreography. The medium of practice and the medium of performance are the same thing. The gap that AI creates in academic work, the gap we talked about yesterday between how a student performs with the tool and how they perform without it, is structurally very difficult to sustain in those domains. Now, to be clear, the performing arts and athletics have their own versions of this problem. A dancer can mimic choreography without internalizing the technique. An athlete can execute a drill correctly and fall apart under game pressure. The gap doesn't disappear entirely, but it closes faster and more visibly because the feedback loop is tighter and the performance context is harder to fake. The coach, watching a basketball player in practice, is watching the decision-making happen in real time. There's no finished product to read. There's only what the player actually does. So that's the contrast I want to work with today. Not the performing arts are perfect, but that they have something academic work mostly doesn't. The practice and the performance share the same medium. Now, there's a well-established principle in cognitive psychology called transfer-appropriate processing. The core finding from Morris, Bransford, and Franks in 1977 is that learning transfers best when the conditions under which you practice match the conditions under which you'll be asked to perform. If you study material in one cognitive context and are assessed in a different one, the transfer is weaker. That's not a controversial finding. It's one of the most replicated results in learning science literature. Now, if you apply that principle to what we talked about yesterday, think about how a student completes work with AI assistance and then is assessed without it. The practice conditions and the performance conditions don't match. That's not a moral argument about academic dishonesty. It's a learning science argument about transfer. The student practicing with AI present, that is generating or suggesting, filling gaps, is practicing in a different cognitive context than the one the exam will create. The violinist who's been playing with the metronome knows that the metronome won't be on stage. They practice with it and without it. Both are part of the preparation. The reason this matters in classrooms right now is that AI has made the mismatch much larger and much easier to sustain without anyone noticing. A student doing an essay with significant AI involvement isn't just using a different tool. They're operating on a fundamentally different cognitive context than the one in an unassisted exam will place them in. The gap between those two contexts is exactly what showed up in Berkeley's failing grade data, and it's exactly what Wang and Zhu documented in the study we discussed yesterday. Students who use AI freely during practice and then fell below the baseline when the tool was taken away. The violinist doesn't encounter the unassisted performance for the first time at the recital. Academic students in many classrooms right now do. So what does this mean for teachers, coaches, and district leaders? Now, I want to be precise about what this argument is not. It's not an argument for teaching to the test, for turning daily instruction into a rehearsal of the specific exam. That'd be the wrong takeaway and it would make instruction worse, not better. A more useful frame comes from Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, whose work on understanding by design many of you already know. Their concept of a transfer goal is the idea that the real aim of instruction isn't performance on a specific task, it's the development of a capacity that students can apply independently in new situations without being told how. The assessment is designed to reveal whether that transfer has happened, and the instruction is designed backward from that goal so that everything students do along the way is oriented towards the same destination. What can this student do on their own? That's a very different orientation than practice the exam. The violinist isn't preparing for a specific program they'll play at the recital. They're developing musicianship, a real capacity, and the recital reveals whether that capacity is there. The practice isn't a rehearsal of the performance. Both the practice and the performance are aimed at the same underlying thing. Now, if you apply that to the AI question, the problem isn't that students are using AI during practice and then facing a different task at the exam. The problem is that when AI is doing the work throughout instruction, the transfer goal, the capacity for independent thinking the whole sequence was supposed to build, may never actually develop. The exam doesn't expose a mismatch between practice and assessment. It exposes the absence of something that was supposed to be built. Transfer-appropriate processing, back from Morris, Bransford, and Franks, adds the research grounding. Learning transfers best when the conditions of practice match the conditions of performance. But the UBD frame clarifies what that means in practice. It's not about simulating the exam. It's about keeping the transfer goal, independent, unassisted thinking, in view throughout the instructional sequence so that students are regularly working towards it, not encountering it for the first time when the test arrives. So, implications. For classroom teachers, the design question to think about in any AI integrated unit isn't, does this look like the exam? It's, does this build towards the thing the exam is trying to reveal? If the transfer goal for a writing unit is that students can construct and defend an argument on their own, then some portion of the practice needs to involve constructing and defending arguments on their own. Not because the exam requires it, but because that's the capacity the whole unit is supposed to develop. AI can be part of the sequence. The question is whether it's supporting the development of the capacity or substituting for it. So for instructional coaches, when you're working with a teacher on unit design, understanding by design gives you a concrete entry point for this conversation that doesn't sound like make sure they practice without AI. The question is, what's the transfer goal for this unit? What should students be able to do independently at the end? And then working backward from that, where in this sequence are students actually practicing toward that goal under conditions that will build the capacity rather than replace it? The question reframes the AI conversation away from restriction and towards design. For district leaders, your AI integration guidance is implicitly making claims about transfer goals, whether or not it names them. When the guidance describes AI as a support for brainstorming, drafting, or feedback, it's describing a role for AI in the instructional sequence. Is that role aligned with what you want students to be able to do independently? If the transfer goals in your curriculum frameworks call for students who can write, argue, analyze, solve on their own, and your AI guidance doesn't address how those capacities get built alongside the tool use, there's a gap. Want to end by returning to something the performing arts makes obvious that academic classrooms can lose track of. The recital isn't punishment. The game isn't a trick. They're the point, the moment the whole practice sequence has been building towards. Students in performance-based programs generally understand this intuitively. The practice is in service of the performance. Every rehearsal is oriented towards a real moment of unassisted demonstration. Academic assessment can feel like the opposite of that. It feels arbitrary, disconnected from the work, something imposed from outside rather than built toward from within. Part of what AI has done is sharpen that disconnect. The work students do all semester can now look very different from what they're asked to do when they're alone in a room taking a test. Closing that gap is not primarily a technology policy problem. It's an instructional design problem. And it's one that music teachers, coaches, and theater directors have been solving in their own domains for a very long time. And I think that's good news because it means that there are plenty of precedents available to explore an improved approach to instructional design. So finally, do you build deliberate, unassisted practice into your instruction? Not as formal assessment, but as regular preparation. Have you found ways to make the conditions of practice match what you'll eventually ask students to do on their own? And if you're in the performing arts or athletics, do you think about this differently than your colleagues in academic subjects? And how often is this a topic of conversation between you? If you have questions, comments, thoughts, and reactions to this episode, I would love to hear them. Please share your notes in the comments. I'll read every word. Thanks as always. See you next time.